Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, in whichever part of the world you are in. I am Gavin Standen, the president of the Indo-Australian Chambers of Commerce, and I also head the partner ecosystem in Telstra. On behalf of the Chambers, I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar on the Indian Union Budget 2023, primarily giving you more facts, analysis, and impact, organized by the Indo-Australian Chambers of Commerce and the ANZ Banking Group India. For this year, I'm sure all of you know the union budget has increased its capital outlay by almost 35%, which is equivalent to about 7.5 lakh crores. The budget is primarily focused on improving and raising capital expenditure by the government, making sure we still have the right level of fiscal consolidation and prudence, trying to give you more incentives and rebates in the new income tax regime. But I pretty much would like the experts to really break it down for us. And in that parlance, I would like to welcome our guest speaker and our expert, Mr. Sanjay Mathur, the Chief Economist of Southeast Asia and India at ANZ. Sanjay joined ANZ as a Chief Economist for the Southeast Asia and India region in 2017. He was most recently the Head of Economics Research at the Royal Bank of Scotland, where he led research teams across economies, foreign exchange, rates and credit, and prior to this, he held senior economic roles at Barclays and UBS. Sanjay has an undergraduate degree in economics from the University of Delhi and a master's in economics and finance from the University of Rochester, New York. And I will be amiss if I don't thank Rufus Pinto, who's the country head for India for the ANZ Banking Group, and his team, Arshad and Bhuvaneshwari, for readily agreeing to support us in organizing this briefing for all our members. A special thank you to Gina & Company, who are our event sponsors. As all of you know, Gina & Company is one of India's leading provider of technology-driven supply chain solutions. They're one of India's largest freight forwarders in the global market and consistently rank in the top 3 logistics companies of India. They have a wide network across international agents who are leading forwarders in their respective countries. They currently service a host of industries which include chemical, pharmaceuticals, automobile, engineering, retail, and fashion, and are pretty much a one-stop shop for all important export supply chain and logistics solutions. So they also have their offices in Australia, based in Melbourne, Victoria. So let's get straight to the webinar. The webinar is for about 60-odd minutes. Before that, a few housekeeping items. In order to reduce a lot of background noise, please mute your microphones. Apart from Sanjay, who will be speaking, at the end of the session, we will be taking some question and answers. So please type in your questions in the Q&A box. And as we get to the end, I'll be more than happy to moderate that session for you. So with no further ado, over to you, Sanjay.
Thank you, Gavin, and good day, everyone. So firstly, on behalf of ANZ Bank, I'd like to thank you all for investing your morning with us. We're always cognizant that you have a choice of speakers to turn to, and in that context, we are really appreciative for picking us. So what I'm going to do over the next few minutes is to address really 3 issues. One, discuss the broad contours of the budget. Then I want to spend some time on explaining as to how this budget really fits into the longer-term strategy of the current administration, what they want to do with potential growth, how they want to change the complexion of the Indian economy. And thirdly, we'll also look at the budget numbers, the fiscal arithmetic that underlies this budget, and how it weaves into various market parameters like the currency and interest rates. So let's start out with the first issue. Now, we know that the finance minister laid out 7 priorities, but I think there are a few standouts. The first was inclusive development. The second was unleashing potential, or rather ensuring as to how India can raise its long-term trend growth. And the third, which is obviously related to trend growth, is the issue of infrastructure and investment. What does it really mean? So as Gavin also mentioned at the beginning, that this budget is all about CapEx. So there is a considerable step up in infrastructure spending. And if you look at the capital spending of just the central government, it will rise by 33% to 3.3% of GDP. Add another trillion rupees to that, which has been earmarked as 50-year free loans for capital spending to state governments. And that number then rises to 4.4% of GDP. Put it in a historical context. This is a 20-year high that we're going to hit. And one thing to mention over here is that when we look at the track record of capital spending over the last few years, it hasn't really missed targets. It's a bit here and there. Sometimes it exceeds, sometimes it falls. But the old era where you would earmark, say, X amount and you would end up with 30% of X, that doesn't happen anymore. Now, within CapEx, the focus is pretty wide-ranging this time, but a lot is focused on specific issues. One of them is last mile connectivity. There is also within that, to get that, there is a lot of focus on railways and highways this time. It doesn't stop here. It's also in the rural sector, aviation and green energy. And what specifically, how that translates into a goal, I'll come to that. But there are about 100 new projects that have been identified by the government. The third aspect, and something we in the marketplace very often forget and overlook, is the rural sector. Now here the government is keen on establishing an agriculture accelerator fund that basically aims at providing farmers affordable information services. It also steps up rural housing. Separately, and lastly, and we should not underplay the relevance of this particular issue, is that the government is introducing a stipend scheme for students in vocational training areas. So these are sort of the broad contours in terms of the direction of spending. Now, obviously, a lot of these issues have been discussed in the media. What is perhaps less discussed is the underlying thinking. And let me just speak for a few minutes on this issue. So I think one is that the government is very clear that it wants to raise the share of manufacturing in India's GDP from 17% to 25%. The goal is ambitious. It's by FY26, or the year that will end in March 26. To accomplish this objective, there is a clear need and understanding that we need to improve our supply chains, we need to establish industrial corridors, we need better connectivity. Now, I'm not saying that we are going to achieve this necessarily by FY26, but let's extend the timeline to FY30. So that's an additional 5 years. The impact on GDP is going to be tremendous if the share of manufacturing in GDP rises to 25%. That means that our manufacturing sector will grow at the rate of 12% each year. And that translates into more than 7% GDP growth each year. That's 7.2% to be precise. Another related issue is that India has sort of been helpless when it comes to energy security. And I don't think that there is very much that can be done about it, at least in the next 5 to 10 years. India will remain an importer of fuels, and it will remain vulnerable to fuel prices. And we saw that in 2022. But they can mitigate it. As manufacturing exports grow, India's trade balance would improve. And that means we can accommodate a higher energy import bill into without sort of risking external sustainability. So that's a very important thing. So the fiscal does fit into the broader jigsaw of strategy. Then there is a need to fix supply chains. And if you look at India, the supply chains are quite weak at this point in time. So a crude estimate is this. Supply chain logistics in India takes up about 12% of India's GDP. Globally, it is 8%. So there is such a big scope to sort of extract efficiency gains from the system. So in that context, there is this is really a step forward. Lastly, I discussed that the human capital aspect should not be dismissed. And there is a shortage of vocational skills in the industrial sector. And many companies, and I'm sure you would also have felt that particularly in the manufacturing sector, there is a lack of skilled personnel. There have been various consultancies who looked at it and said, oh, a good part of the population is not fit for employment. So not in 1 year, not in 2 years, but at least over the next 5 years, the stipend scheme for vocational students is going to help. And then lastly, you have the rural sector, which unfortunately for most time, it has been allowed to stagnate and it has been appeased by subsidies. Farmer incomes have remained very, very stagnant, and that really the rural sector accounts for 52% of total employment. So now if you have better information systems, farmers will be able to improve crop planning. That will potentially improve incomes. And this is a critical issue for the economy because if we need wholesome growth, that is, we don't want a K-shaped recovery, we want income inequality to come down, this is a step. The choice, of course, can be that you keep giving subsidies, but that is not going to help anyone in the long term. This is a long-standing issue, and we're happy that this is being addressed now. So net, we would think that the budget needs to be appreciated in totality and in light of its strategic objectives. Now, for the fiscal arithmetic. So the government is targeting a fiscal deficit of 5.9% of GDP for the year. And this is a reduction of 0.6% from FY23's projected outturn of 6.4% of GDP. Now, what this number implies is obviously limited fiscal consolidation. And if you add the debt of the central government plus the state governments, you do end up with public debt of more than 85% of GDP. Now, admittedly, this is a high number that is quite high by emerging market standards. So the question is, could more have been done? And I think this really needs to be kept, and I would defend this fiscal strategy of the government because there are a few issues. The first is that even though the deficit is high, the quality of spending is improving. And if I may, it is improving by leaps and bounds. So this is not just confined to the central government level, it extends even to state governments, where we are seeing a concerted effort to improve infrastructure, and that warrants a high level of spending, at least in the initial years. Second, if I look at the global context today, there is considerable uncertainty. The data that comes out of the US, EU has been quite challenging. Whether they go into a recession or not is still unclear, but we need to protect ourselves. So I think what they've done is that they're projecting growth of 6.5%. We think it will be closer to 6, but nonetheless, you want to reduce the band of uncertainty around this growth number. Therefore, there was a need to maintain a supportive fiscal policy. There is also a structural imperative in the global backdrop. I think what we've learned over the last 1 to 2 years is that the global order is changing rapidly. And by that, I mean that the exceptional growth that China was delivering is coming to an end, the end of China's exceptionalism. There is a clear need recognized by most businesses, and in light of the geopolitics as well as China's slowing growth, that perhaps there is a need to diversify supply chains. Now, you can only diversify it and have a China plus 1 or 2 strategy if you have the relevant infrastructure, if you have the relevant vocational skills. And I think that this is something that probably has gone into the policy calculus at this stage. And the third is the real experience of emerging markets that you see. We've noticed that while it is very fashionable to sort of say that, oh, you really need to cut back on government spending, but in reality, in emerging markets, we've seen that whenever you've had a rapid withdrawal of spending, you enter a period of slower growth and disinflation, And that only hurts your tax revenues, and you never really resolve the pain that is inflicted. So that certainly is something that needs to be kept in mind when formulating fiscal policy in India or in most other emerging markets. The second issue is whether the budgetary numbers are realistic or not. We are sort of concerned slightly because we do think that the fiscal arithmetic is mildly challenging. The main issue here is that the budget assumes tax collections of around 10.5%, which is the same as nominal GDP growth. Now, this may be relatively hard to obtain when growth is slowing. Even so, we've done some sensitivities around it. We do not expect a major shortfall. And we don't think that we will end up in a situation where the government will end up borrowing radically more, or it will have to cut back on the promised capex spending. So yes, slight risk, but not something that is unmanageable. Now, as far as financing is concerned, and this really takes me to sort of the final point, is that you would have noticed that the media has been talking a lot about the gross borrowing program, why it is so high at 15.4 trillion, and it is undoubtedly high by historical standards. Part of it is due to the fact that redemptions for the next 3 years will remain elevated, so the gross borrowing will be high. Yes, it does become an issue because unlike last year, the year before, we are now starting to see that credit demand from the private sector is picking up, and it will be relatively harder for the government to borrow. So we should be prepared this year that interest rates will probably rise. It will also have some implications as far as the rupee is concerned. So every time, and last year the situation did not permit it, but we do think that the balance of payments would improve this year, and we will see more foreign currency inflows now that the Fed is closer to ending its tightening cycle. But we do think that the RBI will take every opportunity to buy foreign exchange so that it can improve the onshore liquidity situation. So what that really means is that you will have a stable rupee in the range of 81 to 83 rather than an appreciating rupee. Now, this shouldn't be a problem, we feel, because this does really dovetail into India's into the government's Make in India campaign as well. So to summarize, we've obviously got a budget that is heavy on capex. It is sort of increasing outlays in the rural sector. And that is a very powerful catalyst from the broader objective of, or it's a manifestation of longer term goals. Yes, the fiscal arithmetic is, there could have been more consolidation. But again, I want to stress that it should be viewed in the context of longer term objectives in light of the uncertainty we have in the global environment, and it will probably help in safeguarding growth. Lastly, I think that if we were to extrapolate what is happening in terms of capital spending, let's go back to 2 years, we started to pick up then, picked up or delivered more on the momentum in net last year. And this is becoming a pattern. And I think that this is a virtual cycle that we need to emphasize. So let me stop over here. I have deliberately kept it short so that we can entertain as many questions as possible. So let me hand it back at this stage.
Thanks, Sanjay. Appreciate that quick, brief across this whole budget portfolio. I would really encourage the participants to put your questions in the Q&A chat box that is there, and I'll be more than happy to moderate it. But as you're thinking through your questions, let me probably prop up one for you, Sanjay. I think so today, when you really look at our Australian businesses in India, and I think so we are heavily leaning towards a lot of the services businesses. And there are two parts that really we hedge very heavily on. One is on foreign exchange, because a lot of them are local currency contracts. and some of them are global contracts. And the second one is fuel prices, because it not only drives our supply chain, but also our logistics within the country. What is your, if I may use the term, advice for Australian businesses? Because we can clearly see even the Australian dollar is appreciating vis-a-vis the Indian rupee in both ways. Unlike the US dollar, which is usually taken as a watermark whenever we do forex math. So I just want a question to you is, what is your advice for Australian businesses to manage these two headwinds?
Yeah, so I think that as far as fuel costs are concerned, we cannot do very much about fuel costs at this stage. Now, having said that, I think what we will probably start to see over a period of time is the fact that is there rising share of Urals oil and that should help to bring down prices. So if you look, until sort of 2022, India's share of Russian oil used to just meet about 0.2% of its needs. That number has gone up substantially this year, and the pricing is obviously much more different. So just to give you an idea, that the conventional India's oil basket used to be is still actually running at about $88 a barrel. What you're getting from this source is, slightly under $60. So the gains are huge. So I do not foresee that energy will be such a big issue this year. And I think somewhere later in the year, we may actually start the benefits of this being passed on to businesses. As far as the currency is concerned, I do not want to sort of discuss the Australian dollar, given that, that's not really my area of specialty. But like I said, that we should be looking for stable rupee. So the much of the movements are going to be really in the Australian dollar versus the US dollar. But nonetheless, my recommendation would be that we should hedge our exposures here. And that should be a dynamic strategy. It's just too volatile a global currency environment. It's worth losing a few points, in favor of stability would be my view.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Sanjay. So, folks, if you're still looking at questions, please drop it in the chat. In the Q&A chat window. So, a follow-up question on that, Sanjay, is more on some of our weak supply chains. I think so. You gave some very, compelling stats where, India's supply chain accounts for almost 12% of GDP, vis-a-vis a worldwide benchmark of around 8%. That's very startling, right? It pretty much says you're technically 50% inefficient, if I really take it that way. Where do you think, this can really be tightened, and how? What, in your point of view, from an economic standpoint, what do you think is really driving this?
So I think that there are two parts. There's a hardware problem and there's a manpower problem, right? So I think if you look at the hardware part of it, it has been connectivity, which has improved. But like I said, where we are still missing out on is last mile. The second is that when you sort of look at the agglomeration of industries in most countries, which are of a manufacturing scale, where the manufacturing sector is important, you actually see that industries have concentrated, or of a particular type have been concentrated in one area. Whereas historically, in India, the establishment of industries has either been proximity to natural resources, which is perfect, but it has been based on state incentives, whether it's a tax holiday, etc. Now it's good to take advantage of that, but what you've ended up with is an infrastructure that is not supportive. You do not have the right manpower sometimes. And this is something that really needs to change as industrial corridors build up. That's the second part. The third part of it is the sheer sort of, and I'm not saying economy-wide, but in certain industries, just the sheer presence of intermediaries complicates the situation. So that's a third aspect that needs to improve. And I would, of course, say that this is most profound for the agricultural sector, we know. That also implies that within this lack of logistics, you see a phenomenal amount of wastage. And that is something that with the right investment in warehouses, etc., it should and hopefully will change. It is a non-contentious issue, but the focus around it has been very little for several years.
Okay. That's a fair point, fair observation, Sanjay. And I think so this is more for the startup friends who are probably here listening to us. I know you didn't touch on the startups, but if you really look at the startups, what are some of those incentives that they can really look forward to in this budget?
I think not an area of my expertise, to be honest, Gavin, but I think that the longer term sort of, to me, what I thought was, and I mean, this may be a bit off the mark, was that, the government is going to invest in AI institutes, etc., in terms of training in technology. And if I look at it from a longer term perspective, I think it is far more powerful than sort of providing a tax incentive. I think that the availability of the right skills is a phenomenal achievement. Now, it is not going to happen in 1 year. The institutes will be established this year, but I think that is what we should look forward to, because when I look at the success of other industries in India, and you had earlier pointed out, Gavin, that is from an Australian standpoint, services is a very important industry. And if you just think of that industry where we have reached some sort of critical mass with skills, today, India is the back office of the world. So I think 33% of all back office operations are in India. But that is possible only if you have the relevant staff. And I think that is where the whole focus of digital information, startups will all come into play in the next few years.
Got it. Thanks, Sanjay. And I think so. Yeah, that's a fair point, because apart from vocational skills, I think so there's also need to be a focus on digital skills, because a lot of startups today are looking for digital skills. There are a couple of questions that have come up on the chat, and thanks, folks. So Velu Murugan from TAV Systems. By the way, TAV Systems is an Australian company doing a lot of assembly processing in India. So his question is, can we consider the tax relaxation in future as we have for manufacturing companies in India?
In terms of, you mean in terms of expanding to other sectors? Have I understood that question right?
I presume, because I'm just looking at face value, Sanjay.
Yes. It's hard to give a conclusive answer to that. I think that, right now 17 clusters have been identified. And I think these are sort of what I want to say, target sectors. And until they fructify, it was going to be unlikely for the government to extend them to other sectors, because once you start expanding the list of sectors, then there is no priority, there's no strategic sector left. So my guess is that we will not see any immediate changes to this policy, perhaps for 3 years.
Okay, got it. So I have another question coming in from Sanjay, from Sandeep Bhatia. The question is, what do you think the impact of the PLI schemes, which I presume is production-linked incentive schemes, announced by the government of India, will be in the medium term? How do you look at the USD $100 billion in 2022 of a trade deficit that India has with China? Does it need to be remedied at all? US had a $386 billion deficit in 2022 calendar year with China. So I think so the question is pretty much, should India do anything about this trade deficit that we have with China?
Yeah, so hi Sandeep. It's been a long time since we've chatted. So just for the record, Sandeep and I used to work together way back from 97. So Sandeep, I think, the first question is India's trade deficit with China. And I think the real issue is that at the immediate juncture, India cannot really change this sort of structure. The reason being that India's exports to China are really in the form of raw materials, whether it's industrial raw materials, etc., mining materials, and India imports everything from capital goods to sort of light engineering goods and consumer goods from China. So the relationship is undoubtedly quite mismatched. And but if I then take the first part of your question, which is the PLI scheme, and that is where the delta really comes in from, that over the next few years, India should be able to have a much stronger manufacturing base. And that is the whole goal of moving, or one of the goals of moving India's share of manufacturing from 17% to 25%. That entails manufacturing sector growth of 12% each year. And once you start to obtain that self-sufficiency, your own manufacturing exports should pick up. And that by itself will mitigate or change the complexion of the trade we have with China. It will also mitigate the trade deficit we have with China. That, I think, would be a natural progression. There is no need to sort of do anything from a policy perspective in terms of clamping down imports from China or trying to force a change in the trade pattern as of now.
I agree, Sanjay. You can love them or hate them, but you can't ignore them, right? That is what it is. We need to learn to live with it. Any more questions? More than happy, folks, to give it another minute or two. It'll be great to really pick Sanjay's brains here. Okay, Sanjay, I think so. Folks will probably reach out directly. We will definitely put this up on YouTube and on LinkedIn. So if there are any questions, we'll probably direct them to you, and we'll be more than happy to answer them. But most importantly, Sanjay, I think so this was a fantastic exercise that we did, which is bringing our facts and factoids together with no undertones of any political lineage or anything else. It's all about true facts, and that's very, very important. So thanks a lot for that. So we'll close a little early since there are not too many questions. So on behalf of the Indo-Australian Chambers of Commerce, I'd like to convey my special thanks to Sanjay for his insightful briefing on the union budget. I think so it was pretty much toned down to a great extent. Probably you need reams and reams or read reams and reams for you to really understand this. Again, Rufus and your team for all your support. Thanks to the event sponsors, Gina and company. And most importantly, I think so the folks who work behind the scenes is always left out. But I do not want to miss thanking the CEO of the Indo-Australian Chambers of Commerce, Petula Thomas. She is not here today. She's busy heading to the Investor Summit in Uttar Pradesh. Aditya, Ruben, Anahita, Raghav, and Nikita for their teamwork and effort. So thanks a lot, everyone. Appreciate your time, and see you. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye.